Greetings, everyone. My name is Mark Hallett, and I'm the Director of Grants Programs at the statewide nonprofit Illinois Humanities. I'm actually filling in welcoming you all for board member and chair of our grants committee, Susan Manning. Susan is not feeling well today, so we thank her for all that she does for Illinois Humanities, and we're also sending her strong vibes for a very quick recovery. So welcome to what is the fourth in a series of 2022 capacity building workshops. Today's program is titled How to Grow and Manage Your Volunteers Program. Please note as we begin that today's session is being recorded, so please give permission to that. Also, please be sure to mute your mic if you haven't already. The overall goal of this series is to help strengthen the nonprofit cultural sector across the state of Illinois. The goal today is to be in community with you all and to explore together a topic that is at the heart of nonprofit success in carrying out and furthering our missions. So, two quick items. I'm sure that everyone on this call is familiar with the organization Illinois Humanities, but in case you aren't, Illinois Humanities is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities and is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1974. We carry out a number of programs and have had actually a grants program since our inception in 1974. Our mission at IH is to strengthen the social, political, and economic fabric of Illinois through constructive conversation and community engagement. Secondly, we did want to open today's session with what is called a land acknowledgement. So at Illinois Humanities, we respectfully acknowledge that the land on which our main office is located is made up of the territories and lands of the people of Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, as well as many other tribes who have called this land home, including the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, and the Menominee nations. These nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territories. However, these lands continue to carry the stories, resilience, and tenacity of these nations. Despite the federal and local government enforced policies of genocide of American Indians, Chicago is actually home to the third largest urban Indian population, representing more than 100 different tribal nations. We also recognize that land acknowledgement statements are most meaningful when they're actually coupled with a commitment to programs and actions that support Indigenous rights and cultural equity. We acknowledge that Illinois Humanities is just starting this journey and that we have more work to do, but we're committed to supporting and building sustained relationships with Indigenous organizations throughout Illinois and encourage you to support these organizations and efforts as well. So in Illinois, these organizations include, among others, the American Indian Center, Trickster Cultural Center, American Indian Health Services, the Center for Native Futures, and the Midwest Soaring Foundation. So I'm going to turn this over now to our panelists and to Jenny Mushinsky, who is helping the grants program out considerably in 2022 and who will be moderating today's program. But I do want to thank Jenny, our five panelists, all of you for being here today, and especially my colleagues Zerlene Thompson and Jen Yu in advance. Without Zerlene and without Jen, the grants program at Illinois Humanities simply comes to a screeching, lurching halt. So without any further ado, Jenny Mushinsky.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Jenny. I'm glad to be here today. And again, thank you all for joining us for this session. I know as someone who's worked with volunteers for many years in various nonprofits, that today's workshop is going to provide some very useful information for all of us who are continually learning and growing and learning how to best engage volunteers to help shape our audience experience. The Illinois Humanities capacity building workshops are really about sharing resources, but also about building community across statewide organizations. And the topics for these workshops were identified by the 2022 Emergency Relief and Recovery grantee partners. So by partners, for partners. So we're excited to have you here learning together with us. We'll be using our chat today to provide some responses, resources, share questions and comments with one another. So before we jump in, I do want to share our community norms for the chat conversation, which Mark will also copy in the chat for you to read along. The first being to create space for multiple truths, to celebrate and embrace different perspectives. The second, to give and receive feedback respectfully. Third, to acknowledge the difference between intention and impact. Sometimes the things we say may have a negative impact on others, regardless of our intent. Fourth, to acknowledge that people are different, are at different places in their understanding and learning. So let's be open and generous to new people learning new things. There's always room for mistakes and there's always room for growth. Please do use the chat to share any questions for the panelists throughout the session. Here's a glimpse of our agenda for the afternoon. We're working our way through it. We'll start by sending it over to the panelists. They'll each introduce themselves and talk a bit about their organization and their work with volunteers. Then after a short break, we'll have a discussion with our panelists, and any questions our audience that you share in the chat, we'll be sure to bring to their attention. And at the end, Mark will close us out with some announcements and opportunities from Illinois Humanities. So at that, take a look. Here's our speakers. We've got 5 wonderful speakers joining us today. Alyson Thompson from Marshall Public Library, Danielle Chenoweth from Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, Jason Frazier from Mind's Eye Radio, Mireya Fouche from One Heart, One Soul, and Sarah Lynn Ross with Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. Thank you all for being here. And with that, let's turn it over to today's panelists. All of them have been at one point or another where you are at now on your journey with volunteers. Our first panelist to speak is Alyson Thompson. And we do apologize, there was an error with the recording, so the beginning of her presentation got cut short. So we'll jump right in to where the recording picked up. Apologies in advance. Enjoy.
The 50 that we have. And so I said, I think we can do this. And a lovely thing happened. Our volunteers from the Friends of the Library group said, we agree. We think that this is something that is important to our community. We need to preserve local history. And so we formed a committee. And that committee was comprised of different roles. So I spearheaded the committee. I was kind of responsible for recruiting and finding those members, and then really finding, and this is the key, I think, to volunteerism, is finding the role that fits the person. And so we had a couple of local people who loved to interact with the public and who also had a lot of Marshall's history available to them. And so we set them up as our interviewers. We had another person who was kind of a type A personality, and she liked to be busy. So we set her as the person who was doing the cold calling and the interviewing, scheduling the interviews. We had another person who was responsible for the technology element. And so we started putting all these roles on different people to make this goal of 100 new interviews available to the community online. Our local newspaper caught wind of it, and they began featuring a story every week in the newspaper. And so then we started getting all these comments from the community. Hey, we want to interview. We want to preserve our family's history. We want to preserve our business's history. And so then we were able to get them in and interview them as well. I think for me, the really what is sort of the heart of a good volunteer program is finding out what it is that your community wants or needs, and then looking at your mission statement and your vision and trying to solidify whether or not it is really in line with what the needs and wants are. And we had to adjust. We changed our mission over the years to reflect this historically minded community. Another example, if you go to the next slide, is not only did we do our oral history collection, but we also had our friends of the library had wrote grants and done fundraising to digitize our newspaper archives. So we have one of the best newspaper archives in the state of Illinois. And that's because our Friends of the Library group are passionate about local history. And when people are passionate about something, they don't mind putting in the time that's needed to get it done. And so we have all of these newspapers all the way back to the Civil War that are digitized and available online by searchable key terms. Another really neat thing happened that worked hand in hand with our historically minded community was we began featuring historic photos. We had a local patron, community member who was sort of known as the local historian, and she had really for decades, I would say 30 plus years, collected historic photos about Marshall's history. And I was looking for a particular photo, and I remember I was wanting to get a train station photo, and I knew that she had it. And so I called her into the library and said, "Hey, can I get a copy of that photo?" And I remember she pulled out this bag from inside of her purse, and it was like 10 little USBs that were in this bag with like 3,000 historic photos. And I remember my heart sank just a bit because I thought, oh my gosh, what if she loses this little bag? And so it took me about a year, but I was able to talk her into donating those 3,000 plus historic photos to the library. Well, then COVID happened, 2019, the dreaded, what was it, March 17th, 2020. I think we all remember it, like, as the day. Well, I reached out to her and I said, people are at home, they're lonely, the library's closed. Can we start featuring some of these photos through Facebook? And would you be willing to at least put a title and a date attached to it so that we could just put those out there and spark some conversation? Well, she went above and beyond that, and she got together some friends and colleagues or other volunteers really to begin writing short stories about each of these photos and the history of these photos. So we started putting them on Facebook. I thought, oh, we'll do, maybe one or two a week. We ended up doing one every day for a year. And it was bigger than we thought it would be. People were stuck at home. They were lonely. They were looking for a mission, a purpose. And we were able to reach people in a way that sparked conversation and gave people hope. And I remember going into the grocery store multiple times, and people would stop and say, "We love these historic photos. We love hearing the history of Marshall." Well, again, our newspaper caught wind of it and they started featuring it online. And now we have people coming to the library regularly with historic photos and saying, "Hey, here's a story that we think is worth sharing and worth preserving." And so then really what we discovered is that, of course, we had gotten everything kind of on a digital platform, but it really wasn't available on a global platform. Sure, we had it on the internet, but unless you knew about Marshall Public Library, you really didn't know to look for this type of information. And so their Friends of the Library group began looking for grants, and we were able to find one through what's called the Illinois Heartland Library System. It's a library consortium that serves the southern part of Illinois, and they said they would take on not only our historic photos, but also our oral histories and digitize them. So all of our oral histories then became available through transcription and searchable by key term, and our historic photos were the same. But they went on to a nationally recognized website called the Illinois Digital Archives, which is a historic website that will get a broader audience than we could ever possibly get through our little Marshall Public Library website. So I guess if I were to wrap up and say that, there's just one thing that I could say was really important about getting quality volunteers, it would be to find out what it is that your community wants or needs. Maybe that's through questionnaires, surveys, meeting with committees or groups. But really, I find that when your program, whenever your mission aligns with what the community, like what Mark said, the heart of your community, whatever whenever your mission aligns with the heart of your community, then I think it's pretty easy to find those volunteers. And then if you can find those volunteers that really highlight their strengths, and then give them the attention and honor that they deserve by maybe recognizing them. For example, the person who had the historic photos, we were putting her name front and center. She was the one who donated this. So on the very last slide that I have here, you can just ask yourselves these questions. You know, what is it that your community is trying to tell you? What is it their passion? And how can you find volunteers that have that passion? And it's okay if things change. You know, when I first started and I had these dusty cassette tapes, I never thought that we would have 300 plus oral histories online because volunteers were able to were willing to put in the time and effort that it took to make that happen. I never thought we'd have over 3,000 pictures. One of the best newspaper collections in the state, because volunteers were passionate about local history. And so I think it is important that you are organized and that you have committees and that you really designate people with roles that match their strengths. And to me, you know, when a volunteer is finding that they're doing something that's actually meaningful to their community and meets their desire, then you're going to find that finding volunteers is a little easier than if you don't. And I think that's all I have, Mark.
Jenny, is
I'm
Jenny?
back.
Jenny? Oh, yay!
It's gonna freeze now that I'm talking again. That's how the world works. But thank you for keeping us going, and thank you,
Thank you,
Alyson.
Jenny.
Great to hear from you in this like truly community-driven priority, a task and a big project that you weren't even anticipating or wasn't really part of the strategic plan, but has taken you a lot of places. So thank you for sharing. Next up, we have Jason. Or just kidding, my notes are out of order. Danielle, the slides are true. Danielle is next, my mistake. Danielle, let's hear about your work at UCIMC.
Awesome. Thanks, Alyson. That was really inspiring way to start. It's really fun to hear a story about, you know, it's kind of like many hands play light work, you know, make light work. It kind of sounded like a barn raising, you know, like a history barn raising where you kind of crowdsource all those pieces. So good, happy afternoon, y'all. Usually I really love to speak to people in person, and I really do not like, you know, Zoom is much more challenging. So I'm going to ask you to do something to help me feel like we're all in the room together. If you can just turn your videos on for a second and be like, if I say, how y'all doing this afternoon? You give me some jazz hands, okay? All right, how y'all doing this afternoon? Oh, yay, okay, I get to see your beautiful faces. That is really lovely, thank you. That's kind of the energy I feel like I need when I start a presentation, and sometimes doesn't happen. You can, if you're eating or whatever, you can turn your video off or you can leave it on. It's nice to see your faces. So this first slide, if you can just go to the presenter. Okay, so I'm going to speak primarily as the president and co-founder of Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center. We are based at the, you know, where the University of Illinois is, Research One University, south in the cornfields. We are a mighty East Central Illinois organization that does a lot of work to serve the state, the country, and we do have some international ties. I also currently serve as the supervisor of Cunningham Township. So we work with homeless and near homeless residents. And I actually run a volunteer and internship program here as well. Some of my interns are School of Social Work students. I am the former organizing director at the Center for Media Justice. And what's interesting about that network, the Media Justice Network, is it's many grassroots organizations across the country, many of whom have volunteers as a major part of their force and their power. So I help to kind of network and support many organizations. We were 100 strong when I was there, many of whom were using volunteers to power a lot of their programs. And I'm working on a book that I hope to finish by the end of this year called Democratize This, How We Make the World We Want, that really answers the question, how do we make change in systems? So anyway, stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. So this is our independent media center. Yes, that is a squirrel on our front porch, as is a large rocking chair. We purchased the post office in the center part of Urbana. Yes, we would love to have you come visit us anytime. We're right in downtown. We have a 30,000 square foot building with lots going on inside of that space. And then we have kind of networks and connections, and you can see our mobile, our logo kind of located in central Illinois. We really focus on art, media, and technology for social justice, and we've been doing this for 22 years. Next slide. So part of what I think my piece of this equation can bring to the table is talking about an organization that is primarily a decentralized, volunteer-led and driven organization. We are really a nest for many fairly autonomous projects under that umbrella mission of supporting underrepresented voices and perspectives through media and arts projects and educational programs. Next slide. So this is kind of what we look like. We are largely powered by volunteers. Miriam Larson, our executive director, is on the line with us today. Hi, Miriam. And so she's one of our small 3.5 FTE staff. She's small, small but mighty staff that helps to support our organization. And the last time I counted, we were at 25 plus full-time equivalents and volunteers. That may have grown because I counted 2 years ago, but that's where we were then. So you can kind of see, maybe we have 30 staff at the, full-time staff at the table, but it's distributed across hundreds of people. So this is a list of some of the programs that we have at our Arts and Media Center. Sarah Ross, who's on, it was really nice to be sitting next to her on this panel because I met her through the Books to Prisoners program. We have a newspaper, a radio station, a maker space. We have a performance venue and gallery. We are currently incubating nonprofits. We've been doing that slowly over the last 20 years, and we now have 7 nonprofits in a more formal incubator that we're working with. And we have youth media programs. And then on the right side, you can kind of see some of our fiscally sponsored projects. We we're kind of the only place I know of in this area where someone who has an idea can come and basically start an organization as long as it is approved by our board and under our mission, where they become tax exempt through our fiscal sponsorship program and can essentially start doing the program and the work. And a lot of times our fiscal sponsees spin off into their own organizations. So we kind of incubate, support, and cultivate those groups as they build. But other times they're just one-offs. They want to do a specific event or program. I think Amira Davis did a program that was focused on Black history for youth over the summer, and she got funded through the Illinois Humanities Council, and we fiscally sponsored that program, and she held it at the Independent Media Centers as an example of kind of a one-off where we were able to support them. Next slide. So essentially seeing it's believing. So I just want to put a few slides in to kind of show what we look like, what our programs look like. Yes, this is us building our own radio tower, which we did from scratch. We had a young woman who grew up here who actually did all the welding on the station, on the Adrienne Bauer, who's in Chicago now. This little kiddo is actually like graduating from high school at this point. That shows you how old I am. Ben Betcham was our artist in residence for several years. He actually he was staying at the homeless shelter, had a studio at at the IMC, was a prolific painter, and taught artwork in the school district through a relationship he built with the school district, and now lives in Ohio and is a working artist. So essentially we were, he's one of many examples of artists kind of getting their start or dealing with some uncertainties in their life and getting back, building their artwork and their portfolio while working at the IMC. Next slide. Yep, and so here's this is kind of our meeting space on the right-hand side. We have a performance venue. We just, for years, we hosted Girl Zone and Girls Rock, and we have a beautiful mural on the outside. Next slide. Okay, so kind of to geek out under the hood of what this looks like in terms of a volunteer-powered organization, our program work is really done by our volunteer members. So we have 5 working groups, the fiscally sponsored project, our incubated projects. We basically co-sponsor events, and when it's not pandemic, that ends up being 100 plus in a year. We have an artist in residence program that right now we're in the process of relaunching with the opening up of the space. And then we have a lot of kind of one-time volunteers for work days, et cetera. And so that program work is really kind of in the center. And then there's kind of a care team around the program work. We have 142 members on the books. We actually probably have another 100 who say they're members but have forgotten to pay or whatever. So it's a couple hundred folks, and they elect our board and set our structure. So each year they convene in December. We have a really active board. Our volunteer board members are working members, and they kind of lead different committees, finance and facilities, programming, fundraising, and personnel. So they're kind of providing capacity support. And then we have our 5 paid staff members who are listed here. Next slide. So wanted to kind of show how an organization can kind of support volunteer-led programming. So essentially, you know, we provide kind of structure and voice because we are a membership organization. So the members can you know, make their wishes known and initiate new projects. We provide space in our 30,000 square foot Arts and Media Center, and we're constantly working on improvements to that space, murals, beautification. We're working on increased accessibility at this point. We provide that nonprofit status and tax exemption, fiscal management, bookkeeping, and reporting. We incubate folks to become their own nonprofit if that's what they want. They also could just stay with us for a while, and some have. And then we kind of do outreach, storytelling, and amplification of fundraising. So if there's a fundraising initiative of one of the programs, we can kind of use our list, which you know, attempts to kind of conglomerate the contacts from the many different programs. And then we have a long and distinguished history of convening conferences, Books to Prisoners, National Books to Prisoners Conference, a grassroots radio conference, Midwest Zine Fest. I think, Sarah, you were involved in that. There are a lot of different things that we've done over the years that really helps to bring people together across the programs and to support them in kind of like cross-pollination. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about keys to our success and also challenges that we face that I think could be instructive to anyone running volunteer programs. But I will say that the way to get the most out of volunteers is in many ways to kind of match authority and responsibility. So the more responsibility someone has, then the more authority they should have. And we've, you know, early on when we started the IMC 22 years ago, we used to say those who do the work make the decisions. And what was nice about that is it's more of a culture than it is a policy. It's not like, well, you didn't do enough work, so you can't vote. It's more like in our culture, we really look to the people who are doing the work. And we welcome their decision-making power, and that a little bit keeps the chiacchierate from happening, you know, the like chatter, and it, like focuses us really on like what is the work at hand and how can we dive into that. We've always focused on kind of protecting the basics, so making sure that when we do invest in staff time to support volunteer work, we're making sure our nonprofit status is whole, our finances are solid, our facilities are working. And when we don't protect those basics, then all the other, the nest is not taken care of, right? And so we talk to our members and our volunteers like, we got to invest in the nest. The nest is what kind of holds all of these different volunteers. I think one of the things that happens in organizations is that it's hard to give people authority because sometimes they're volunteers and they're not vetted like staff members are, and you don't know exactly if their skills can handle something. And I guess one of the things we've done at the IMC that's instructive is that we create a kind of low barrier sandbox. Like we don't really invest money in a project unless we did invest in youth programming, and we have in the past, like in our venue, but typically we say you are self-sustaining, right? So you bring in money, you spend money, we provide the nest, and you know your program might grow it might shrink, it might work out, it might not. You might hold an event that no one comes to. You might hold an event that like is so big that the fire marshal is called. Both have happened, you know? And so I think one of the things we try to do is to say, yes, volunteers, bring your energy, you know, throw things against the wall and see what sticks. And don't, you know, and then we don't have to really control things so much. So in some ways, how do you know, if you want to stimulate certain programs or certain things to happen, how do you kind of call the energy that's already organically moving in your community? How do you kind of harness that and support what exists so that it could grow into something that could, where it's kind of a collaboration between that energy and the organization that you're working with. And I feel like the IMC has done a really good job of that. And that's kind of where a lot of our growth have come from. And what it also means is if something fails, we just really protect the nest. Like the nest does not get hurt by a single egg breaking. So then we're not so scared about the egg breaking. We don't have to control to make sure the egg breaks. We do have to make sure we don't get sued. We do have to make sure we follow the law. We do have to make sure that, you know, what we're doing is within our mission. We don't allow hate speech. There's certain parameters that we have, and we do vote as a board on any program that we're going to basically sponsor. So there is a vetting process there. But essentially, I would say we try really hard to support the energy that exists. So we love to give kind of opportunities for time-bound projects that don't need ongoing care and feeding. It's actually really okay for, you know, I love the Alyson story, and I love that it's continuing, that you are, you know, volunteers continue to come forward and share history. But what would happen if some of the steam runs out on that? It sounds like that's cool. We can actually celebrate that whole cycle of that project. And it's not a failure just because the energy moves someplace else in the future. And then I would just say one of the things that we really tried in the last 2 years, and I want to thank Miriam for this in particular, is like, especially as the pandemic wears on, really understanding that what volunteers need has changed. They used to get a lot of their social needs and connections from a lot of different places. And now there's a lot of, you know, duress. And so this is a really important time in our organizations to boost our appreciation, to boost our ability to handle conflict, to give more social time, to give breathing room, to give breaks, to like figure out how to bring positive vibes and fun into the work we do. We've always needed that, but I think you all know, having lived on this planet the last 2 years, that this is just a really important time for those pieces. Next slide, please, and then I'll wrap it up. I know I'm getting, so areas of growth for the IMC. I think some of the areas when you do have kind of volunteers, you know, having a lot of autonomy and they can move in many directions, we do feel challenged in having kind of shared governance, planning, and storytelling, and really having an overall sense of the we. So, you know, that's a balancing act. We don't want to have one voice. We're not one identity. We're many identities, but also we can kind of feel diluted by that. We really, you know, are working on building shared analyses and developing skill sets. So like more trainings, education, and opportunities to convene. And when you're thinking, when I do volunteer work, especially at the township, I really think of it as a political and social education program, so that there is actually folks who come into our volunteer program are learning something. In Books to Prisoners, this might be the first time they've had contact with somebody in prison, right? Or it might be the first time that they have family members who were in prison, but there wasn't an interaction around what you want to read, what you want to learn, right? So there's like new ways of interacting that come from that. So really thinking about the education component and what do people, how can they develop and grow themselves through the volunteer opportunity? And then I think, you know, we struggle with building capacity because there's a lot of things we would love to be able to support volunteers better with: volunteer recruitment, fundraising, you know, managing grants and prospecting them. And, you know, we would like to be able to grow our staff. We do have board turnover, so we're looking at addressing, you know, we bring in board members every year, kind of lengthening the board term so we can have more stability in that, in the support for volunteers. And our decentralized structure is, I oftentimes feel like we're like the university where all the departments kind of like bicker with one another sometimes, and it's hard to figure out how to feel like we're all part of a we. Next slide. Thank you. I appreciate your time and happy to take any questions you might have when we're done with our presentation as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. I love hearing how you're like positive despite like there's some like chaos in a way. You're always kind of moving and flexing and working with the volunteers and just making space for, every individual as has their own personal kind of capacity and gifts to bring to the table. So thanks for making space and rolling with it. Great to hear from you. Fabulous. We'll do one more speaker and then I think we'll take our break. We're cruising up on the hour here. Jason, where are you at, Jason? Good to have you. Jason joins us from Mind's Eye Radio. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Glad to see everyone. I can definitely relate to Danielle too, coming about kind of in that adjust and adapt mentality of kind of keeping things going. So definitely can appreciate that too. My name is Jason Frazier. I'm the president and CEO of Mind's Eye. I've been there for 10 years now. A little bit about Mind's Eye. I'll use our mission statement to kind of help me build this. So our mission statement is to translate vision to audio we build a more inclusive community by doing so for individuals who are blind or visually impaired. So when we do that, we do it through 3 programs: our radio reading service, our audio description program, and also our beat baseball program. But I'm going to start kind of giving you a little bit of our history of how we got here. So in 1973, that gentleman and I'll also do something else to kind of give you an idea for audio description purpose of what we do. Typically, before I even like to talk, I usually describe myself for anyone who's blind or visually impaired and kind of when you're kind of setting the room. So I'm an African-American gentleman who I wish I had hair, but I am bald. And also with a beard with a little bit of white in there, wearing a blue polo that says Mind's Eye Audio Description. So kind of when we're talking about these pictures, I'll try to do some of the same in some instances too. So Father Bonnie, he's an oblate priest. If you're kind of familiar with that collar, the white collar gentleman, this picture from like the 70s. Here in front of a sign that says Radio Information. So he founded the organization in 1973. He wasn't a radio aficionado. He was not, even when it comes to blindness, didn't really know a lot about either. But someone said, hey, here's this program where you can read magazines, newspapers, books, any printed material on a radio stream for people to get the printed word who usually couldn't if they were blind or visually impaired. He said, I don't know much about it, but I'll help. So when he was launching this service, the oblate chapter asked him the question, how are you going to read all these programs? How are you going to read the St. Louis? We're based in the Metro East Side, so we're pretty close to St. Louis, so we cover both sides of the water. So I asked him how he's going to read those local papers, how you're going to read the national things like USA Today, grocery store ads, how are you going to take care of all that? And he said volunteers. And they about laughed him out the building. They said, that'll never work. That'll never happen. How do you plan on getting people to volunteer their time to read programs that are hour long from newspapers every day? As you can see, we were founded in 1973. We're getting ready to celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. So we figured out, he figured out in the beginning, and we continue to figure that out since then. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've been able to kind of do that and transition to that. Kind of looking at our programs, on the next slide, I think it's, so like I mentioned, we have 3 key programs. The broadcast program is a program we've been doing since 1973. That's what we were founded upon. That's what we've been doing ever since. Hasn't changed. Like I said, volunteer readers come into our studio, and that's changed a little bit since COVID, and I'll get into that too. Come in and they read local newspapers, whether it's like from a magazine, newspaper. Most of the time now, we're reading from iPads, so we don't get a lot of physical papers anymore, but that's a little different too. We also have volunteers that help out like podcasts, that some of those volunteers are also visually impaired. So we've actually been able to change some of our content, we call them content listeners, to content creators. And we have them help volunteer as well. Then our Beat Baseball program. I don't know how many people are familiar with Beat Baseball. There's kind of a picture of it. It's a game of an adaptation of baseball with a player wearing a blindfold. We do a recreational tournament each year where we let sighted players participate, but we also have a traveling team called the Gateway Archers that participate in national tournaments around the country. And go there. It's if you haven't seen a Beat Baseball game, you got to check it out. And then we do audio description. I can now kind of do what Danielle said. I can make sure people with their cameras on. How many of you have ever seen The Lion King? Whether it's the 1994 film adaptation or the one with Beyonce and their voice acting. I know someone's seen one of the versions, but if you look at the first 10 minutes of The Lion King, there's that scene where Simba's being born on Pride Rock and Rafiki's holding him up, and there's have songs going that the animals are coming out there. If you go back and watch that scene today and close your eyes, you won't be able to pick up any. There's no dialogue. There's nothing telling you what's happening. So what audio description does is provide the visual elements for anyone who's blind or visually impaired while they're watching something similar to that. If you go on Netflix today, you can watch their original shows. They have an option for that on Netflix. But we do it at live venues here in the area. And we kind of expanded. We're doing an air show this weekend in Chicago. Even, we're based in Belleville, Illinois, but we're doing an air show this weekend in Chicago. We do mini theater performances, even sporting events. Going there and not only doing the play-by-play, but the kiss cam. Trying to describe that little hat dance is quite a challenge, but we try to do that too. So that's kind of a little bit of our key programs that we have volunteers who support Mind's Eye through. I'll go to the next slide here. So as I mentioned, our broadcast information program. Like I said, before 2020, volunteers typically came into our studio. We have 5 recording booths and we had a live newsroom. So every morning from 8 to 10, we would have live news being read from the local paper, the Belleville News-Democrat. And since we're right across the river in St. Louis, is right there, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. 2 volunteers would sit in the booth, read it together, and the newsroom read it together. Other volunteers read those programs in those recording booths. As someone pointed out, March 2020. And we were kind of, I want to say a little bit, we kind of hit out a little early because I think that in December, there was a flu bug that hit and it took out staff, it took out volunteers. They're sharing microphones, they're sharing things when they're talking into. So we kind of made a decision on March, I think 11th, to shut down the studio for that reason, because of not knowing what happened with COVID. So that left us in kind of this weird spot of, volunteers were used to coming into these booths, picking up their programs. How do you continue doing that? How do you get new volunteers? For a while, staff did it. There's only 6 of us. At that time, I think there was only 5 of us. So trying to figure out how to make that happen, how to train volunteers from remote now, was kind of a big thing. Because typically when volunteers came to us, we got a lot of retirees, a lot of teachers, a lot of people who are connected somehow to our mission. Someone whose grandmother who may be blind, someone who has a relative, some maybe just looking for junior service hours from high school. So we had over 200 plus volunteers that we then were going to have to figure out how do you recruit, how do you retrain, how do you do different things with broadcast from remote. And we kind of navigated a couple things and made this easier. So if you have your smartphone right now, I know if you're not using it for this meeting, so don't, but there's a feature in there called, like using on iPhone, I'm going to be familiar called voice memo. So we figured out a lot of times that quality from there and what we can do in the studio, we could have volunteers actually read, they have a tablet or they're reading from a hard copy magazine or book, read from there, just talking to their phone like this, or they can buy a little microphone and extends it. We can get programs that way. This second picture on here is actually someone's home studio they created. So it's a guy who's an old broadcast guy. We get a lot of, broadcast guys, working in their voice acting, or guys who maybe have retired. He set up his studio in his basement and start reading like 4 programs a week for us, because we were so short on volunteers during that time, because we read 132 hours of content each week. And that's even grown, because you can see on that picture right on the left-hand side is a picture of an app we just developed. So people can not only have to listen to an old radio box, which we used to send out with SCA radio with their station, they can download the Mind's Eye app. And those volunteers are now providing content for that app 24/7, and you can get those programs on demand. So it's actually helped our listeners by being able to create that. Also, they have an Alexa skill. They can say, hey, Alexa, play our Amazon device with an Alexa skill. Alexa, play Mind's Eye. So now our readers, our volunteer readers, not only are covering probably listeners for our particular area in the Belleville, the Metro East area, but now they're actually hitting stations or people up north. We actually expanded to Springfield, Illinois. Now our service is up there. Even sometimes nationwide, because we're one of the few reading services with an actual app. So now our volunteers get that sense of fulfillment of not only I'm providing this service for people around me, but there's people in Iowa that need the pet hour every day because they want to know how to best take care of their dogs and cats. So they're also now getting that content. So we've been able to transition a lot, and also it's helped us recruit new volunteers, because not only can we get volunteers who are in our area. Hey, if someone's like, hey, I don't have a reading service, but I like to volunteer and read, or they're going to move, they can still read from us for remote, because we can teach them how to read on their smartphone, or set up a cheap microphone. And I mean, his isn't cheap. That's a pretty expensive microphone there. But there's ways you can set up a $30 microphone from Amazon or Best Buy and plug it into your laptop, and you record your programs and then just Dropbox it over, and we edit it and it goes on the air. So volunteers are able to contribute from whether it's from home, or we still have some now that come back into the studio and read on a regular basis too as well. And so we'll go to the next slide. And kind of talked about a little bit about that. But one thing about our volunteers, as you kind of see here, this is Corey. He is actually going to be one doing the air show this week, and he's an audio describer. He's going to be right there. He's audio describing the St. Louis Cardinals game here in the area. But one of the things about our volunteers that we've been able to do, because I said we started out as a radio reading service. Now some of our volunteers are actually doing our other programs. So Corey was a reader. He read comic books. Now he's an audio describer. The reason we were able to start our audio description program in 2016 is one of our longtime volunteer readers was doing it at one of our local theaters already. We kind of leaned on her to get us off the ground. So not only are our volunteers sometimes just doing that broadcast program, they start doubling over and doing other things, or we find new volunteers to kind of fit that niche. Because when people come in, our main requirement for broadcast reading is, can you read? That's our first step. Like, as long as you can read, we'll take you and find a place for you. But we also try to make sure the volunteers stick around by figuring out what they like to read. We might not necessarily have those programs open, but if someone tells me I love to read sports, I'm probably not going to stick them with the home and garden show. I'm probably going to try to find something in that parallel to keep them engaged. And that's one of our big things of keeping our broadcast volunteers engaged. Or even with audio description. This program has some perks because you get to go to Cardinal games. When you're going to go see a show like The Lion King comes, the national show comes, and you're an audio describer for that, they give you 2 tickets ahead of time to go to preview the show. So before you go audio describe the show for someone else, you get to see it, take notes, but you can use other tickets. Sometimes it takes someone with you to also enjoy that perk with you. So we try to make sure we have things to keep our volunteers engaged and moving. And but a lot of it is more so for the benefit of just helping others. But you also want to make sure they're getting some type of reward, some type of things going on. We do a volunteer appreciation every year. Even in COVID times, we found some way to showcase appreciation for our volunteers. That was important for us because without them, we're not on air. I know from the pandemic, I can only read about 4 hours a day. So we can't get through 132 hours just with our staff. So we do a volunteer appreciation every year to kind of showcase them, whether it was, we did a drive-through with donuts. We basically, in COVID, we handed them some donuts, a box that we didn't open, and they kind of just kept on sorting through. We used to do a barbecue each year before that, and our broadcast director, Tom Williams, would dress up in a costume. He would dress up with whatever he's cooking. He'd find like hot dogs, he'd find a brisket costume. He'd dress up every year, and the volunteers would come out and write signs about why they volunteer. And that helps us know what keeps some certain volunteers engaged, so we can kind of duplicate that for others. And that was important too. And also that camaraderie. A lot of times you get volunteers that come in and read their programs, and they may know somebody else who's volunteering. That may be how they got to the place in the first place, is that word of mouth. But I think also it gives them this thing of, when they get to their volunteer appreciation, they become part of a network. They start realizing, hey, I read this program. And they start talking about what programs they read. Or our live news readers, they would be two strangers. And sometimes they would form bonds outside of that to be, hey, they were a live news team, just like your anchor team. They were the Wednesday live news reading crew. So it just found a way to keep our volunteers engaged and interactive, and also building their own network too. Guess we'll go to the next slide here. And this kind of just talks about, and that's one of those signs I was talking about, that Steve at our volunteer appreciation, he wrote a sign, said he goes to use his voice acting for good, because he's a voice actor. So he volunteers his time, and it helps him keep up in his craft. He reads Time magazine. I had to think about it for a second. We have a lot of volunteers, so trying to remember what they read every week is sometimes be a challenge. But yeah, he reads Time magazine. He's been doing it before I even started working at Mind's Eye 10 years ago. So he's been there for quite some time. And we have a lot of longtime volunteers. We have a volunteer, Lynn Williams, who's been volunteering since 1975. We opened in 1973. She still comes in and reads department store ads every week, like clockwork, every Sunday. Hasn't stopped. So, just keeping them engaged there, and they just feel a part of the mission. Also, a lot of our volunteers outside of reading or audio describing or doing stuff for Beat Baseball, also are part of a lot of our committees. We even now have a program advisory committee where we have people who use our services, but we also have volunteers, so we can get feedback from them on how we can best, adapt our programs, not only for the people who are listening, but also how can we improve our volunteer engagement? How can we improve our things that help volunteers do their job too? So we make sure they're part of a committee like that. And some of our volunteers are our biggest supporters, because they do buy into the mission. When it comes to fundraising, they're usually at the front of the line there for us too, which is very important and very motivating for you to see people who are doing the work are also supporting the work. Next slide there. I think I'm about done. So just probably in closing for me, I know we're on time, I think one of our biggest challenges is capacity, going forward, because now we have 3 programs. Audio description, for example, when we started that program, we wanted to do 8 shows a year. In the month of June, we did 29 shows in the month of June alone. So, just with growing programs and, expanding to different areas, our biggest challenge is getting even more volunteers and building our capacity. So I think, just with Mind's Eye and just our work growing and kind of our mission, we've been able to find people who have bought in, but also maybe not even only buying into one thing, but they keep coming back and buying into more. So.
That's great. Thanks, Jason. I'm keep thinking of like things I might want to read now that you can participate from anywhere. So hopefully you've just recruited a whole group here to come reach out and volunteer. And it's amazing what a little bit of humor and sugar can do to build a network and keep them coming back. Thank you, Jason. Well, to that, we're going to take a 5-minute break, get yourself some sugar, find a little humor. We'll come back it's 2:03 right now. So let's come back at 2:08 and we'll get started with our last 2 presenters and some questions. During the break, Feel free to use this time to think of questions or specific things that may be pressing in your own organizations. Add them to the chat. I'll be gathering up questions to kind of help us build a discussion and pull even more helpful tidbits and resources out of our speakers. So do use the chat, put some questions in there. And if you do have to check out early, be sure to complete the program survey. It's super, super helpful for the team at Illinois Humanities. Mark's going to drop that link in the chat. It's a super, super short. I think there's 8 questions and you'll know the answer to all of them. We'll see you back in a couple minutes. Thanks all.